Hello everyone, my name is Jonathan Lang and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Today I'm here to give comments on a paper by Gina Mazzella entitled On the Merging of Care Ethics and Virtue Ethics, Benefits, Difficulties, and the Proper Balance. Now before I launch into the commentary though, I just want to say how pleased I am to be a part of this online conference. I think having a conference like this provides undergrads with a really great opportunity to share and get feedback on some of their ideas, and to do so in a low-stress environment, while at the same time, allowing them to gain experience formally presenting those ideas. So I think this conference provides a real educational service to young philosophers, and I hope that it will continue far into the future. Now on to the commentary. Now, as the title of the paper implies, it's about care ethics and virtue ethics, and specifically it's on whether the two can and should be merged, and the consequences that might arise as a result of their union. I myself have a minimal background on this particular issue, and I by no means consider myself an expert in virtue ethics. So I just wanted to say up front that this paper was really fun and interesting to read because it was very educational for me. It provided a nice overview of the literature on integrating virtue ethics and care ethics, and Gina did a really nice job highlighting what each theory stands to gain and lose in the merger. In addition to this, Gina advances a lot of interesting arguments in the paper, and these arguments ended up being very thought-provoking for someone like me who is new to this debate. So I wanted to say overall that I really enjoyed reading Gina's paper. I do have some concerns about the paper, of course, and I think that the best way to situate those concerns is by first beginning my commentary by invoking some important distinctions and then discussing the major points in Gina's paper in light of those distinctions. But to briefly give you a preview of the main points that I'll be bringing up in the commentary, I'll just say two things very quickly. In this commentary, I intend to first argue that Gina's paper is a little bit too relaxed when it comes to specifying what care ethics actually is. And I think that this lack of specificity presents an obstacle to Gina achieving the goals that she outlines for herself in the paper. So that's one thing that I'll be arguing. The second thing is that I'm going to argue that Gina's proposal at the end of her paper is a fairly radical one, perhaps more radical than Gina herself even realizes. I'm going to explain why this is so by comparing her proposal to a similar proposal that's endorsed by Maureen Sanders Stout. And I'll ultimately be concluding that Gina's proposal will need to be at least slightly revised in order to remain interesting and defensible. Okay, so I want to begin by reviewing the goals that Gina outlines for herself at the beginning of her paper. Then I want to make a couple of distinctions, and then I want to try to characterize Gina's position in light of those distinctions. So Gina's paper begins with her outlining two goals that she wants to accomplish by the paper's end. So with regard to this issue of combining virtue ethics and care ethics, she states on page 1 of her paper that she intends to, 1, quote, explore the benefits and difficulties of the combination, end quote. And she also says that she wants to argue for the coexistence of care ethics and virtue ethics in a way that enhances both. What is this way for both virtue ethics and care ethics to coexist? Well, Gina wants to argue that there needs to be a proper balance between the systems such that they should complement each other without necessarily being conjoined into a single ethic. Now, given the goals that she lays out, it seems like Gina is actually interested in three fundamental questions, and it might be good just to take a moment to discuss these three questions and how they're related, just so that we don't end up running them together. So first of all, there's this question of compatibility that we might be interested in when it comes to merging care ethics and virtue ethics. And that question is just the following. Are virtue ethics and care ethics actually compatible with one another? Can they be combined in such a way that the result isn't some kind of, completely incoherent moral theory? So let's call this question the compatibility question. Now, I haven't defined what it means for two particular moral theories to be compatible. I guess there's a lot of different ways that they could be compatible. Like they could have, clashing principles of right action, such that they each kick out conflicting prescriptions. It could be that they, endorse irreconcilable theories of value. It could be that they have, radically clashing ontologies that can't be consolidated. I mean, there's all kinds of ways in which they can be compatible along many different dimensions. So I'll just be referring to incompatibility here in the broad sense of the term. So anyway, so we got the compatibility question, right? But then there's this other question, and it's a question that arises after we've given an affirmative answer to the compatibility question. And this new question is the following. Under the assumption that care ethics and virtue ethics are indeed compatible, what does each stand to gain and lose from being combined? So since this question has to do with how beneficial or detrimental the integration of the two theories will end up being, let's just call this question the utility of integration question. Now, once you give answers to the utility of integration question and the compatibility question, you'll find yourself arriving at a new question, and it's sort of the main question I think that Jenna is interested in her paper, and I call this question the merger question. And the merger question is just this. Should we actually merge virtue ethics and care ethics at this time? And I take it that compatibility issue and the utility of integration question are going to be important in establishing the correct answer to that merger question. Okay, now generally it would seem that there are two camps that you could find yourself in once you answer all three of these questions, right? You might find yourself being what might be called a segregationist about virtue ethics and care ethics, or you could find yourself being what I call an integrationist about virtue ethics and care ethics. A segregationist is going to say that we should keep virtue ethics and care ethics separate, and this might be because they're either incompatible with one another in some fundamental way, or because we just don't stand to gain a lot by integrating them. In fact, the integration could be pernicious, perhaps. And then, on the other side of things, you could be an integrationist, and an integrationist is going to say, look, care ethics and virtue ethics are indeed compatible, and there is a lot to be gained by slapping the two together, so we should do that. We should go ahead and merge the two ethics. Now, I take it that Jenna's answer to these three fundamental questions that I've brought up are as follows. First of all, she thinks the answer to the compatibility question is that virtue ethics and care ethics are indeed compatible. Second, she thinks that although there's a lot to be gained from joining care ethics and virtue ethics, there are also serious problems that such a merger would pose for care ethics. So her answer to the utility of integration question is that there's going to be some really harsh trade-offs involved in merging these two ethics that are, and the trade-offs here are undesirable. So on the basis of these two answers, Jenna is going to answer the merger question in the following way. The two theories should not be tightly merged together at this time. They should stay separate. So now that we've located Jenna's sort of main position, I think, and we've laid out these three fundamental questions, I want to get right down to my criticisms of the paper. So my first criticism has to do with the disclaimer that Jenna makes at the beginning of her video. I think it comes around like the 1 minute mark or something like that. So Jenna states there that because there's so many variations of care ethics, she won't be giving her audience an idea of how virtue ethics can assist all forms of care ethics. And so she says that she's going to refrain from providing a bunch of different formulations of care ethics throughout her paper. Now I think that Jenna is certainly correct in saying that the notion of care is rather vague and that there might be many possible ways to formulate an ethics of care. And I also agree with her when she claims that because of this, it's impractical for her to address whether and how all the different variations of care ethics might be merged with virtue ethics, right? But while I think it's a tall order to systematically examine every formulation of care ethics, I don't think Jenna can achieve the goals that she sets out in her paper unless she gives, at the very least, a general definition of care ethics in her paper. But unfortunately, I just don't see any such general definition of care ethics anywhere in the paper. So why is it important to give a definition of care ethics and a definition of virtue ethics? Well, one way to see how important it is to just reflect on the nature of the compatibility question for a moment. So in order to answer the compatibility question, it seems that we need either one, an explicit formulation of specific care ethic, or a specific version of virtue ethics, or we need to provide a broad definition of care ethics and virtue ethics. And these broad definitions hopefully will incorporate what is essential to each of the two systems. Why do we need at least one of those two things? Well, I take it that whenever you want to defend a claim of the form that, X is compatible with Y, you're beholden to characterize X and Y. I mean, you need to give specifics about the structure of your two relata here. And so I think that one problem with Jinna's paper is that it lacks a specification of what care ethics actually is, and a specification of what virtue ethics actually is, for that matter. Of course, sometimes it's okay to paint things in very broad strokes when you're talking generally about the potential that two theories might have to help one another. You might say something like, oh, theory A has some strength that theory B doesn't, so if we could somehow integrate them, B would stand to benefit because it would have access to the strength of A that it didn't have before. But the devil is really in the details here. I mean, it's not so interesting to say that maybe the two theories have the potential to help each other out. At least I don't think that's so interesting at this point in the game. What we want to know is how they'll actually benefit one another. And to figure this out, we have to start examining the merging of specific versions of virtue ethics and care ethics, or we need to just at least be very precise in our formulation of what's essential to the different forms of virtue ethics and care ethics. Now, in calling for this kind of specificity, I don't think I'm alone. There have been other authors like Alan Thomas and Margaret Olivia Little, I think, and Robert Veitch, who've all expressed in writing the importance of getting clear on exactly what care ethics and virtue ethics is if you're trying to figure out the answers to what I've been calling our three fundamental questions. So for instance, Alan Thomas, in an article that Jinna actually cites, takes really great care to strip away inessential Aristotelian artifacts from virtue ethics in order to find out whether the most general, plausible form of virtue ethics has anything at all to gain from care ethics. And I think that that's the sort of work that needs to be done here. If you want to make progress on this question of whether the two theories are compatible or what each stands to gain and lose from a merger, you've got to provide some definitions and get into the details. Okay, so that's the first concern I have with the paper. My second concern with Jinna's paper has to do with her answer to the merger question that I mentioned earlier. So it's at the very end of her paper that Jinna begins to provide an answer to this merger question. And the answer that she comes up with is that the two ethics shouldn't be merged. Rather, they should stay separate. Now, this segregationist type position sounds very much like the position of another author, Maureen Sanders Stout, who Jinna actually discusses in her paper and whose proposal Jinna seems to endorse. Now, I think that it'll be fruitful at this time to compare Sanders Stout's proposed answer to the merger question and Jinna's own answer, because I think that doing so will help make clear both the uniqueness of Jinna's position as well as the more radical nature of Jinna's position. So let's talk just briefly about Sanders Stout's proposal. So in her article, The Unhappy Marriage of Care Ethics and Virtue Ethics, Sanders Stout, in a similar manner to Jinna, engages with these three fundamental questions that I've been talking about. Specifically, with regard to the merger question, though, Sanders Stout ends up being a segregationist who believes that care ethics and virtue ethics shouldn't be integrated at this time. Instead of being integrated, she says, they should exist in an open marriage. So what exactly is this open marriage? Well, she says that the open marriage is a situation in which the resources of care ethics can be used to augment or critique or modify other theories, like virtue ethics, but without care ethics being fully coupled or absorbed by those other theories. So why might that be a bad thing? Why might we not want care ethics to be absorbed by these other theories? Well, Senator Stout says the worry is that if we hitch, care ethics to virtue ethics wagon right now, this might obscure important insights from care ethics that could help benefit other theories. And it might also prevent the discovery of new insights resulting from the further development of an independent care ethics later in the future. In addition to this, care ethics seems to provide us with a way of pointing out the shortcomings of virtue ethics and other moral theories, and we don't want to lose this kind of critical resource. So keeping care ethics independent from virtue ethics could be a really good thing because, care ethics could prove to be a useful explanatory and critical tool within the field of ethics, if it just remains independent from these other theories. So it's clear that Sandra Stout's a segregationist about virtue ethics and care ethics. She thinks that we shouldn't prematurely halt the project of developing a promising independent care ethic. And this is why she proposes the open marriage, right? She wants to afford care ethics the opportunity for this kind of, I guess you'd call it theoretical promiscuity, right? The ability to potentially couple with other moral theories in ways that might be fruitful in terms of, scholarship and ethics. And she wants to allow care ethics the independence to still develop in isolation as its own theory, capable of generating criticisms of other theories. So that's why, Sandra Stout thinks that we shouldn't just jump the gun and merge the two ethics right now. It might have a negative effect on the progress of ethics. So now, is that the kind of position, though, that Jenna is endorsing? I don't think that it actually is. So consider the following two quotes from Jenna. Quote, "I feel that the best manner to conjoin these two theories is to keep them as separate and distinct systems of ethics while encouraging the usage of both within a single society," end quote. And here's another quote from Jenna that I want to lay out right away. Quote, "Through the co-functioning of virtue ethics and care ethics, a society would be supplied with a normative guide for their everyday lives as well as an ideal morality to live up to through virtue ethics. The society would also have a secondary system to guide the individuals in those moral gray areas where their understanding or application of the virtues may fail them," end quote. So in these two quotes, Jenna seems to be making two interesting claims. First, she claims that both care ethics and virtue ethics should be used when figuring out what to do, right? When figuring out what the right action is in a given situation. Second, she seems to be claiming that there's a hierarchy between the two theories, that virtue ethics is kind of like the main theory of what we should do, and we should use that most of the time, but then every once in a while we should default to a secondary theory like care ethics in certain circumstances. In what cases are we supposed to actually turn to care ethics and away from virtue ethics? Well, this is where Jenna cites the Heinz dilemma, saying that virtue ethics fails us in the case of the Heinz dilemma because it fails to prescribe the right action, but care ethics does a good job of prescribing the right action. But notice that this view is a lot more radical than Sandra Stout's position. This view seems to endorse a sort of moral pluralism. It's like Jenna wants to say that both theories are correct moral theories and that both need to be utilized. But she also wants to say that the theories sometimes prescribe different actions relative to the same scenario. I mean, that's why virtue ethics, fails us in the case of the Heinz dilemma, right? Because it prescribes the wrong action while care ethics prescribes the right one. But if that's the case, it seems like care ethics and virtue ethics aren't compatible after all. They're inconsistent in an important sense. Now, perhaps I'm wrong about my interpretation of Sandra Stout, but if Sandra Stout is similarly committed to this kind of moral pluralism that Jenna seems committed to, then my criticism applies equally to her position as it does to Jenna's. I just think that moral pluralism seems to be a very unlikely, very radical position to endorse. Now, using the integrationist-segregationist distinction that I brought up earlier, we can put the point that I'm trying to make here in a slightly different way, maybe one that's easier to understand. we said that a segregationist is somebody who prescribes that care ethics and virtue ethics should not be integrated. But segregationists, we've now seen, can come in at least two varieties. One variety of segregationist says that the two theories should be kept separate because as separate theories, they provide us with potentially useful theoretical tools. And so keeping the two separated betters our chances as ethicists of, furthering ethical scholarship, right? I think that Sanders Stout is just that type of segregationist, right? Now, the other variety of segregationist says that the theories should be kept separate for a different reason. It's because they're both true but applicable in different cases. So this type of segregationist, which seems to be, endorses a kind of moral pluralism, and it's this moral pluralism that I find very problematic. Now, I suppose, of course, there could be a third position, a third type of segregationist out there. According to this type of segregationist, virtue ethics and care ethics should be kept separate because while neither is the correct moral theory, both crank out the right kinds of prescriptions in certain contexts. So both theories have value as moral heuristics, but neither provides us with a complete heuristic that would allow us to figure out what to do in every possible situation. So under this view, in some contexts, like the Heinz dilemma, it's better to deploy one theory rather than another in order to figure out what to do. Now, if this is the position, though, that Jinnah is endorsing, she runs into a further problem. She gives us no principled way to demarcate the cases where care ethics type considerations should be brought to bear on the situation rather than virtue ethics type considerations. In other words, Jinnah doesn't tell us which of the theories to use as a heuristic, in which cases, and why. And so if we treat care ethics and virtue ethics as merely valuable moral heuristics, this still leaves us with no way to tell when to use each of these heuristics, and so it renders the heuristics rather useless. Now, Jinnah does say that we should use care ethics in the case of the Heinz dilemma, but why? Is it only because what an ethics of care says that we should do in the Heinz case aligns more closely with our intuitions about what we should do? If so, it seems like both care ethics and virtue ethics aren't even acting like heuristics anymore. They're just theories that we deploy in an ad hoc way to rationalize our intuitive verdicts about certain cases. So qua heuristic, this renders them rather useless in cases where both theories prescribe different actions. Those are my comments on Jinnah's paper. I think that my comments have basically boiled down to two main points. First, Jinnah needs to either choose a specific version of care ethics to work with, or at least provide a general definition of care ethics. Only then can we be sure that the virtue ethics and care ethics that she has in mind are actually compatible, and only then can we assess what the real trade-offs and benefits will be of the merger. Second, I argued that Jinnah seems to be endorsing something much stronger than Sanders Stout's open marriage proposal. She seems to endorse a segregationist position that either, one, embodies a kind of moral pluralism, or two, seems to indicate that care ethics and virtue ethics are merely useful moral heuristics. If the former, I think that her proposal's implausible. If the latter, then Jinnah needs to provide her readers some sort of method of, some sort of criteria for distinguishing the cases where one theory should be deployed instead of another when we're trying to figure out what it is that we should actually do. Okay.